Hello, everyone. We are going to get started in just a moment. Just to make sure everything is working properly, if you can see and hear me, please drop your name and where you're joining us from today in the chat box, which a lot of you are already doing. Oh my goodness. We have such an international audience today, which is so exciting. Oh my gosh, it's going by so quickly, but I saw Scotland, I saw Vancouver, London, Ireland, Florida, Maine, Liverpool, Missouri. Oh my gosh, we have people from everywhere today. That's great. Okay, before we begin, just a couple of quick housekeeping items for you. During the session today, if you have a question, please use the Q&A box. That helps us keep track of the questions that come in, since as you can see, the chat moves very quickly. If you're using the chat to connect with other participants today, please select everyone from the drop-down menu near the chat box to make sure that everyone can see your messages and not just me. And with that taken care of, we can go ahead and begin. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Adams from ProWritingAid, and today I'm joined by Hawley and Rachelle Ramirez of Pages and Platforms. Anne has 5 decades of writing experience and has been a developmental editor since 2015. She is the author of the historical love story Restraint. And like Anne, Rachelle was trained by Sean Coyne of StoryGrid and has edited award-winning and best-selling fiction and nonfiction. She has an MA in psychology from Goddard College, and she is the author of An Introduction to Genre. So Anne and Rachelle, if you are ready, you can go ahead and pop up. I'm going to disappear and learn along with everyone else. And then at the end of the presentation, I will come back to do some Q&A with everyone. And just so everyone knows, we will be posting the replay of today's event to the hub, and we will have the slides available for you to download. So you can rest assured today's session will move quickly because there's a lot of information, but you will have everything to look back and reflect on as you like. So Anne and Rachelle, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having us. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. We have a slide presentation, and it is a ton of information. It's everything we could think of that we wished we had known about writing fantasy when we were back in the sort of pre-editorial phase of our lives. And so we're going to hand it all to you and just relax. You can go over it again. Before we start, I just want to mention that you can grab your free copy of the Pages and Platforms Guide to the 7 Essential Story Types at storypath.me/PWA. Well, what brings you here today? Are you stuck in the process of finishing a fantasy story? Or have you completed a draft, but you can't quite figure out how to fix the problems in it or even detect what the problems are? Have you gotten lost down the research rabbit hole? Did you try plotting first, or are you more of a pantser? In general, are you feeling stuck somewhere along the path to a finished manuscript? Well, we know the feeling. At Pages and Platforms, our mission is to provide fast and practical solutions for the kinds of story challenges that most authors face. And today we're going to show you some ways to build, evaluate, and improve your fantasy story using 4 tools: marketing categories, story types, essential story elements, and world building. By the end of this webinar, you will have a much clearer idea of how to evoke empathy for your characters, create tension and excitement, leave your reader emotionally satisfied with your story, and deliver a thoughtful takeaway. And finally, you'll be able to meet your reader's overall expectation for your story type so that they will be happy to recommend your book and eager to read the next thing you write. To approach those lofty goals, we need to start with one fundamental idea. Brace yourself, fantasy isn't a story type. Fantasy is your story's milieu or environment, and it is a marketing category. Now, this is not to say that your choice to write in the fantasy category or your love for creating whole new worlds isn't super important, because it is. And we'll get to that, so hang on. But as your story's milieu, let's define what fantasy is. It generally means that your reader is going to expect to suspend disbelief to some degree, sometimes a significant degree, The story may reflect things like myth, folklore, or fairy tales, or it's likely to involve the supernatural, the paranormal, or the mystical. It may take place in other worlds or in this world, but with significant differences. The story will be regarded as imaginative, and it will veer from accepted scientific facts of the real world. At writers' conventions and book fairs, which, fingers crossed, we might start doing again here pretty soon, we always ask people who come by our table what they're writing. Most authors who are writing in the fantasy genre will say so, and then they will add something like it's YA, or it's LGBTQ, or it's dystopian, or it's urban. All of these categories tend to describe the kind of world the story takes place in, the level of magic, and the age or orientation of the intended reader. And it's true that many readers are looking only for grimdark or epic high fantasy or paranormal romance or whatever it is they prefer. And you, as the author, need to be clear on what you're offering, because these categories might make or break a potential reader's decision whether to pick up your book. Each of these categories has its own trends, conventions, and rules, and they do change. They're drifting all the time, and you do need to know them. But your fantasy marketing category alone doesn't tell you much of what you need to know as a writer to build and finish your story. Even if you're clear on which fantasy category your story falls into, and I expect most people here are, you might still be having trouble making it work as a story. That's probably because your fantasy category cannot define the specific essential story elements that you need to master in order to write a satisfying story. And those essential elements are, we should put in a little drum roll here, what your protagonist wants and needs. That is what motivates them to enter the story in the first place and keep them going. What they have to gain or lose in this process of going after what they want. That is what's at stake for them once they enter the story. What emotion the intended reader is expecting to feel in reading the kind of story you're presenting. And by the way, they will be disappointed if you don't deliver it. And the fundamental premise or message of the kind of story you're aiming to tell. This is often the reason you chose to tell this kind of story in the first place. So these elements, motivation, stakes, reader emotion, and premise, are what story type is for. And that's a big part of what we're here today to show you. And Rachelle's going to take that over in a couple minutes. Fantasy is a category of story that defines the milieu of where your story takes place, as I said, the environment, the type of world, but it does not define the type of story you're going to tell in that environment. For instance, you can have a love story involving vampires or werewolves. You can have a horror story at the bottom of the sea or in outer space, or a crime story in a magic kingdom. But no matter how exotic the milieu, the story has to work the exact same way as if it were set in modern day Los Angeles in the very grim real world. Your fantasy story and every working story has to show the protagonist having that clear motivation that motivates them to enter the story and face challenges, the want and need. You have to create obstacles and opportunities so that the protagonist has something big to gain and something big to lose, otherwise known as stakes. The story must deliver certain emotions to your intended reader. Not all readers choose stories for the same reasons, but most of us like to read stories in order to feel some kind of way. And finally, your story needs an underlying unifying premise or message that provides a thoughtful takeaway to the reader. If you nail these essential story elements, you will be well on your way to getting unstuck and finishing your story, and it will be the kind of story your intended reader will be eager to choose, to read, and then recommend. Now, I'm going to pass this discussion over to Rachelle. She won't say this, but I will. She is one of the world's foremost experts on the subject of story type, and she's here to share a whole bunch of what she has learned. So, Rachelle?
Thanks, Anne. I am excited to cover this section because choosing your story type is the single most critical decision you'll make in writing your fantasy story. Story types give you the practical information you need for crafting a working draft. That's because your story type determines some very important story elements, such as your protagonist's motivation, also known as the protagonist's wants and needs, what your protagonist has to gain and lose. These are the stakes of your story. What emotion you need to deliver to your reader or how you should make them feel, and the basic premise or message of your story, which is the idea you want the reader to take away. All of these essential elements shape your story and inform the story events. So, what are story types? Story types are a way to understand and communicate the kind of story you're telling. They aren't analogous to marketing categories. Story types are for you, the author, and your editor. As we see it, there are 7 essential story types. Other writers and editors have categorized stories differently, saying there are dozens or more story types, but we've distilled it down to 7 for the sake of simplicity and clarity. They are 7 distinctive plot forms, each with individual character motivations, stakes, reader emotion, and premise. So a quick overview, and then we're going to look at each of these individually. The 7 story types are action, crime, horror, love, worldview, validation, and redemption. Let's look at them one by one, because each of these categories has its own guidelines, and you do want to know them to meet your audience's expectations. The first story type is action. Now, identifying an action story is pretty easy for most of us. Action stories are plot-driven, and they involve escape, chase, adventure, rescue, and rebellion. The action protagonist is motivated by saving lives and restoring safety. Action stakes involve safety, danger, life, and death. And it's important to note that if you are writing an action story, your reader has chosen your story because they want to feel a certain way. The action reader wants to feel excitement and a sense of bravery in the face of danger. It's your job to deliver those feelings. Now, to examine action's essential premise, we should first define what the heck a premise is. A premise, sometimes called a controlling idea or a theme, is a single sentence statement that describes the climactic value change of the entire story and the cause of that change. It's naming the primary story event, what happens, and why. So for action, the general essential premise is that heroic action against villainous behavior leads to safety and saving lives, whereas refusing to act heroically leads to danger and loss of life, and possibly even moral failure. Let's look at some examples of action stories in a fantasy setting. The truly epic high fantasy Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson, in which the fate of an entire world rests on the shoulders of an unsuspecting chosen one. Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. This is an epic young adult fantasy adventure set in a world based in part on West African folklore, where young protagonists must risk their lives to restore magic and overthrow tyranny. It's an excellent story. And The Untamed, one of Anne's favorites, based on the Chinese wuxia or magical martial arts tradition, is the story of a warrior who loses his powers and has to cultivate demonic powers in order to overthrow an enemy intent on total domination. And it's worth noting that The Untamed is also an epic love story. The second story type is crime. Crime stories are plot-driven and involve solving a puzzle, investigating a crime, or planning a caper or heist. Those are my favorites. The crime protagonist is motivated by solving a puzzle or restoring order. They use their brains rather than their brawn. Crime stakes involve justice and injustice, or order and chaos. And if you're writing a crime story, you need to know that your reader wants to feel the intrigue of solving a puzzle before the protagonist does, and the safety of seeing justice and order prevail. Crime's essential premise, the primary idea the story puts forth, is that criminal activity results in injustice and chaos, whereas the pursuit of justice restores social order. So again, we see there's a result, justice and order, or injustice and chaos, which are caused by the specific actions the protagonist takes. Some good crime stories set in a fantasy world include Jim Butcher's Harry Dresden urban fantasy novels, where a private investigator with magical powers solves supernatural crimes. The Rivers of London series by Ben Aronovich, where a police detective is slowly gaining magical powers in modern-day London in order to solve crimes involving perpetrators from folklore and myth. And China Mieville's The City and the City. This one doesn't involve magical powers or supernatural crimes, but a weird and compelling alternate world setting where one city is superimposed over another, and a police detective from one of the cities must solve a crime committed in the other. And yes, it does seem that urban fantasy is a natural category for the crime story. The third story type is horror. Horror stories are plot-driven with a monster intent on destruction and a protagonist who is a victim. The monster can be anything, a human sociopath, an animal, alien, or a supernatural being. The protagonist is motivated by staying alive and avoiding a fate worse than death, such as torture. Horror stakes involve life, death, escape, and torment. The horror reader wants to feel terror and imagine their bravery in facing a monster. Horror's essential premise is that ordinary people can keep evil at bay with courage and vigilance, whereas cowardice allows the monster to win or for evil to thrive. Of course, horror very often has an inherent fantasy element, since it frequently involves monsters, supernatural beings, or paranormal events. Here are some examples. Toni Morrison's Beloved, in which the monster is the ghost of a murdered child that haunts the mother. Note that there is a secondary monster of racism and the people who uphold it operating in this story as well. Another example is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, where the monster is an ambiguous supernatural entity that possesses a house and eventually destroys the family that lives in it. And Neil Gaiman's Coraline, where a lonely child discovers a mirror world behind a closed door where a monstrous replica mother lives. Love. Now, this is our fourth story type, and we are ready for a change of pace and a chance to debunk a misconception, because it turns out that the love story isn't limited to romance novels. Love stories are plot and character driven and involve courtship, intimacy, and often romance, maybe even a forbidden union. There might or might not be a happily ever after for the protagonist. The love protagonist is motivated by winning love, or more often, avoiding vulnerability. Love stakes involve rejection, vulnerability, and intimacy. The love reader wants to feel anticipation, human connection, and vulnerability without risk. Love's essential premise is that overcoming internal flaws makes committed human connection possible, whereas an unwillingness to be vulnerable results in loss of connection. Again, notice that the result, gaining connection or losing connection, arises from the actions the protagonist takes. Love and fantasy make a popular pairing, so let's look at some examples. Truly, Madly, Deeply is the story of a grieving woman whose dead fiancé comes back as a ghost to help her heal and find true love again. Diana Gabaldon's Outlander series, in which time travel allows a 20th century woman to find love with an 18th century man. And Kat Cho's Wicked Fox, a young adult love and action story, brings the classical Korean myth of Gumiho, the nine-tailed fox, into modern day Seoul as a shapeshifter who finds love with a regular mortal. The fifth story type is worldview, often referred to as a maturation or coming of age story. Worldview stories are character-driven, and they involve protagonists confronting their naivete, experiencing disillusionment, or finding meaning. The worldview protagonist's primary motivation, whether they know it or not, is gaining knowledge or avoiding truth. The stakes for the worldview protagonist involve ignorance and beliefs. The worldview reader wants to feel empathetic satisfaction or pity and enjoys feeling comparatively wise and mature. Worldview Essentials' premise is that open-mindedness leads to wisdom, whereas avoiding the truth results in self-deception. The protagonist moves from seeing the world as black and white to understanding their role in a world of grays. Basically, they change, they grow up. You will find a worldview arc in almost any story involving a young adult protagonist, but the story type goes beyond just coming of age. The worldview protagonist could be of any age. Some examples of worldview stories in fantasy settings are Margarita Montemore's Una Out of Order, which sends a young woman time traveling into her own future body and life and explores what it means to live a life fully in the moment, even if those moments are out of sequence. This is an excellent book. Lev Grossman's series, The Magicians, despite many action elements, is primarily the exploration of one young man's coming to terms with his power and its meaning for his life. And finally, Susanna Clarke's Piranesi is the story of a man with no memories locked in a bizarre dream world who slowly uncovers a revelation that explains his amnesia. Okay, validation. This is the sixth story type and one that can confuse a lot of writers. I know it was the hardest for me to sort out. Validation stories are character-driven, and they involve the protagonist's search for success and esteem. The validation's protagonist is motivated by success and honor of gaining validation or approval from others. Examples of that are things like winning the trophy, the competition, or a higher social ranking. Validation stakes involve success, failure, and the selling out of true values. The validation reader wants to feel admiration or pity for the protagonist and enjoy a sense of moral and intellectual superiority. Validation's essential premise is that ethical choices create true success, whereas unworthy goals lead to selling out one's true values. A validation story in a fantasy milieu isn't the most common combination, which might point to a good area for innovation. Here are some noteworthy examples. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke is an epic historical fantasy set in a mostly realistic world of the Napoleonic Wars, featuring two magicians vying for greatness as they try to revive the practice of English magic. The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang about a poor orphan in an alternate history China who must decide whether to make a deal with the gods to unleash her shamanic powers and rise in an elite military academy. And Aaron Morgenstern's The Night Circus, set in an alternate Victorian world, which pits two magicians against each other in an endless competition of magical powers. It's also a love story. Our seventh and final story type is redemption. Now, redemption stories are character-driven and they involve forgiveness or atonement. The redemption protagonist is motivated by guilt, shame, and a desire for forgiveness. Redemption stakes involve connection, selfishness, and altruism. The redemption reader wants to feel satisfaction, pity, or contempt, and probably moral superiority. The essential premise of a redemption story type is altruistic action results in redemption, whereas selfishness leads to moral failure and probably a lack of forgiveness. In other words, redemption results when the protagonist atones for past wrongdoings by abandoning selfish goals and sacrificing for the greater good. They must make an active choice between selfishness and altruism. If they choose selfishness, they lose, and if they choose altruism, they win, but must sacrifice something important to them. Some great redemption stories in fantasy settings include A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, the endlessly adapted story of a miser whose encounter with ghosts causes him to change his ways and help his community. Elia Don Johnson's novel Trouble the Saints is set in an alternate history New York City, where the protagonist, a knife-wielding assassin, must confront the question, can one woman ever sacrifice enough for community? And our final example is the television series The Good Place, where a cast of deceased characters have to come to terms with the fact that they're in hell and must prove that they've corrected their flaws and errors in life. Now, you may have noticed that in several examples, I mentioned a secondary or supporting story type. There's so much to learn about combining story types, and at Pages and Platforms, we've developed a whole 20-module course on the subject in our Happily Ever Author Club. But the short version is that you need to weave a plot-driven story type of action, crime, horror, or love with a character-driven story type of worldview, validation, or redemption to deliver a story that will truly engage your reader. Even the most heroic action protagonist undergoes some internal change, and even the quietest and most introverted of protagonists must face troubles from the outside world. The conflicts between the inner world and the outer world create character change. A good way to innovate on your fantasy story is to try unusual combinations of plot-driven primary and character-driven secondary story types, or character-driven primary story types with plot-driven secondary story types. You can also combine either or both with the love story type, which we mentioned is both character and plot-driven. Remember, the plot-driven story types are action, crime, horror, and love, mostly. And the character-driven story types are worldview, validation, and redemption. Some great fantasy combinations of story types that we've mentioned include a worldview primary story with an action secondary story in The Magicians, a worldview primary with a crime secondary in Piranesi, action primary with love, arguably secondary in The Untamed, crime primary and validation secondary in the Rivers of London series, horror primary with validation secondary in Beloved, horror primary with worldview secondary in Coraline, redemption primary with horror secondary in A Christmas Carol, and love primary with action secondary in Wicked Fox. So to recap, those are the 7 story types. And for each one, we've covered 4 essential points: the protagonist's motivation, which is the required wants and needs, what's inherently at stake for the protagonist, the kind of emotion the reader of the story type hopes to feel, and the essential premise or message. Understanding these 4 elements helps you, the author, meet the expectations of your intended reader. Write a consistent story with a clear beginning, middle, and end, and finish your story. Now back to Anne.
Thank you, Rachelle. I'm sure everybody's heads are kind of spinning. So again, we recommend there will be a chance to rewatch this. You can get the slides and in the download that we will give the link to again at the end. We've summarized most of this. And now for the subject that I think is near and dear to everyone's heart here is world building. And it comes up a lot with my editing clients who are writing fantasy. So we decided to boil it down to a few simple points. We feel that there are 3 main questions that any author of any kind of story really needs to consider about the world in which they're setting their story. Whether that is the most ordinary street in the most ordinary town in the present day, this is a street view of a street near my house, or in a world of floating life pods on an endless sea. And those 3 questions are: what obstacles or opportunities does the world present to the characters in your story? What is your narrative device and point of view? Yes, this is connected to your setting. And how much does your reader need to know in order to keep reading? Let's take a look at these one by one. Under the very broad category of obstacles and opportunities, we include all the things most of us think about as world building. That's the climate and geography, the socioeconomic system, the culture, the level of technology, and if applicable, the system of magic. But that last one, magical systems, all but that last one, the magical systems, apply to any story type in just about any setting. So think about this even if you aren't writing fantasy or you have a non-fantasy project going as well as fantasy. Let's begin with geography. Is rich farmland an obstacle or an opportunity? Is it something to be fiercely defended? Or is it a life of hard work and drudgery that your protagonist wants to get away from? Now, a land as rich and generous and kind as the one in this image is often what a character has to leave in order to enter a story. It forms the magnetic longing that keeps them going through the adventure until they can return home. See both Frodo and Bilbo Baggins for prime examples. Now, conversely, a squalid slum might seem like a terrible obstacle, something a protagonist would want to escape. But innovation, maybe it's an opportunity because all the magic in your world resides among the garbage and the flowers of its poorest people. The relentless desert makes water rights a cause for war, but the desert might also be the daunting proving ground for your protagonist's powers, or the literal geographical barrier between the protagonist and their goal. And how about non-human denizens of your story? Dragons are cool, but do they make sense in your world? Do you have some idea how they fit into the ecosystem? How is it that a creature this powerful hasn't destroyed everything already? What does a dragon mean in your story? What obstacle or opportunity does a dragon present to your protagonist, assuming that your protagonist is not a dragon? If they are, you still need to think about that. Ditto things like fantasy characters like centaurs, unicorns, other magical creatures, any supernatural or paranormal beings, werewolves, vampires, that sort of thing, and humanoid groups such as typically elves, dwarves, that type of thing. How about economics? Does your character's poverty or wealth play a significant story role? You, the author, may need to know a lot about the economic system of your story world, but all we, the readers, need is to see the protagonist digging the last copper coin out of her pocket to buy a bun in order to understand that your protagonist is poor and hungry, and that there is a system involving coins, and that someone bakes and sells bread. And speaking of food, if your story world is a temperate rainforest with bears, or an all winter, all the time frosty landscape, you probably should think long and hard about where they'd get wheat to make those buns. Create a world that is internally logical. If your world includes magic, no matter how you define and delimit the magical powers, resist the temptation to have a magic that can do anything, anywhere at no cost. Now, side note on this is if you're writing in the fairy tale vein, as in, for example, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and its ilk, you can probably get away with talking beavers who have sewing machines and serve tea and scones in their beaver dam, if that's what you want to do. What about technology? What level of technology have the people of your world attained? Where are the constraints of communication? If your characters can communicate telepathically, how does it work? Does it take a toll on the individual? Is it genetic? Is it rare or common? Are there limits? And what about good old written communications? How hard is it to get paper or ink? Can just anybody afford these things? Is there a postal system? Supported by what? Check with Terry Pratchett on that one. In a notorious example of a communication system in a fantasy world, The Lord of the Rings has a significant plot point where a signal fire system transmits word of trouble from mountaintop to mountaintop. It is a glorious scene in the movie, and it has the best music in the whole trilogy. It's unforgettable. But please don't think too hard about who lives on those remote mountaintops and maintains huge piles of firewood and oil, just waiting for the once-in-a-lifetime signal from the next mountain saying that Gondor calls for aid, because it makes no sense. Now, we can give Tolkien a pass because Tolkien, but we are not Tolkien, so we should probably plug those kinds of logic holes if we can. How do people in your world get around? Are they landlocked? Are there animals they can ride? Or do they walk everywhere? Are they beside the sea? How do they build boats? What about carriages? Do they have magical means of flight? If your characters travel, the cost of travel in time and energy, and maybe money, is important. So are obstacles and opportunities posed by the terrain and the weather. For example, are there food sources along the way? What about shelter? Is there a difficult mountain pass? How much of an obstacle is the weather? If a journey from point A to point B in your story is uneventful, completely smooth, nothing happens, you probably don't need to describe it. And the landscape it covers may not be important to your story. The geography and climate of your fantasy world should also dictate things like customs, architecture, food, and clothing. For example, you probably wouldn't put fur coats on characters in a hot desert climate or have priests praying for rain in a rainforest. Consider the physical world of your story and then deal honestly with the obstacles and opportunities it would naturally present. We, your readers, may not need to know much about, say, your monetary system or the religious ceremonies of the world that you have created, but you, the writer, need to build a world where each detail that you do present on the page feels plausible and grounded. Let's talk about maps for a second. Maybe you began your fantasy story with a world and a map, and that's great. By all means, flesh it out. Readers who like adventures in magical lands usually like to refer to the map. Fantasy readers generally like maps. It's a very common, popular item. But your map is not your story. The geography of your world is really only relevant to the degree to which it limits your characters' choices, raises the stakes, defines what they want and need, and supports your premise. So that was the first question. The second world building question, after obstacles and opportunities of your world, is what's your narrative device and point of view? That means who's telling the story to whom, why, and from what distance in time. Now, why is this important? For our conversation today, it's important because it constrains how much world building you can include on the page and how much you need to leave off. David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, which kind of, if you squint, qualifies as a fantasy, has one character in the second part that is literally writing regular evening letters to his lover. Now, we gradually figure out, and that's all that's on the page are his letters. We gradually figure out what's really going on only through what that character might naturally choose to reveal in a letter in writing to that particular person. Your narrative device might not be as obvious as one character writing letters to another, but you do need to have some idea of who your narrator is, why they're telling the story, to what audience, and from how far away in time. This will constrain how much of your fantasy world you should describe, explain, or simply drop hints about. If your point of view character is entering a magical world for the first time, everything will be new. Everything is a potential danger. Everything is unknown. When Lucy first goes through the wardrobe into Narnia, there's room in the narrative for the reader to experience quite a bit of detail through her eyes and her senses, but it isn't explained. It's only described because Lucy herself doesn't understand what she's seeing. On the other hand, if your point of view character is already in their everyday world, what they're going to notice is basically what's different or out of place. And you, as the author, have to select the exact details that that character would notice and that will help bring the reader along in this story. So for instance, everyone in the world of His Dark Materials has an animal daemon, as we see here, that little pine marten, I think it is. So the daemons are mentioned and described, but not really explained because everybody in that world understands them. They don't need explaining. We come to understand them gradually as a reader as they play roles in the story. Okay, now get ready for N.K. Jemisin's Immersion Pyramid. This is a tool that she introduced in her outstanding seminar on world building, and she makes it freely available online as a PDF. So you definitely want to check that out. She takes a very different approach to world building than we do, but this question is so clarifying and answers so many big questions about point of view and narrative device better than anything I've ever seen. So it forms a solid bridge to the third question: how much information belongs on the page? We'll spend a minute or two on it, so you have time to take notes. And again, it'll be in the download. You can watch it again. It's brilliant. This graphic describes 3 levels of reader immersion in this story: high immersion, moderate immersion, and low immersion. Now, I want to make very clear, Jemisin's term immersion doesn't describe the degree of personal engagement the reader feels for the story. Reader engagement is going to be strong at any degree of immersion in a well-written story. That's why, as you're going to see, there are hugely popular stories at all 3 levels. Immersion in this model refers to the reader's sense of immediacy and closeness to the action, and describes the distance between the reader, the narrator, and the protagonist. High immersion stories bring the reader deeply into the story by using a single first-person point of view, usually, I think, in the present tense. This may also include a second-person device, which second person, if you've ever tried it, is weirdly immersive. In high immersion stories, there's very little distance between the reader and the narrator, who is usually also the protagonist. This type of story explains very little. We're getting to how much is on the page here. The strangeness of the world is conveyed mostly through context or in description through the eyes of that first-person narrator. In these kinds of stories, sometimes the reader needs a glossary or epigraphs at the beginning of chapters to be able to make sense of this complete immersion in this strange world that they've just been thrown headfirst into. Some well-known examples of high immersion stories include Red Rising, The Hunger Games, and Divergent. Moderate immersion stories create some distance between the reader and the character by using a strict third-person single point of view, a separate narrator. You may say that the narrator stands about halfway between the reader and the characters. This narrator tends to describe more of the scene to you, the reader, and might periodically interrupt the narrative to explain things. Past tense is far more common than present tense in moderately immersive stories. And if you have any doubts about whether they work, examples of moderately immersive stories include Harry Potter, The Wheel of Time, and the Night Angel trilogy. Now, low immersion stories create the greatest distance between the reader and the character by positioning a narrator closer to the reader than to the action. A third-person, omniscient narrator standing at a distance from the events of the story is able to go into multiple points of view and may even turn and directly address the reader, my dear reader. Prologues are common in this type of story, And the low immersion approach does open up a real risk of info dumping or excess exposition. So if you decide to employ an omniscient narrative voice that can shift to multiple points of view, you need to be vigilant against over-explaining and over-describing your world. Some examples of low immersion stories, again, in case you think they might not work, include Lord of the Rings, Gormenghast, and the Chronicles of Narnia. And you will notice that these are older stories, and the low immersion style is a more old-fashioned style, which does not mean you can't use it. Maybe it's time for a revival, but I want you to be aware of where you're getting it from. And that is N.K. Jemisin's Immersion Pyramid. It's a goldmine of valuable writing insight. And now for that third question. How much information does your reader need in order to keep reading? Enjoy this picture for a moment. Filmmakers add a vast amount of world building detail to every shot. The audience absorbs most of it subliminally. If you've seen this movie, how many of these details did you notice? We've all seen a million film stories, and it's tempting to try to do the same in our written stories, but we can't. Here's a shot from Ryan Coogler's film, Black Panther. At this point, the protagonist, Prince T'Challa, has just undergone rituals to prove his fitness to be crowned king. And now he's out walking in Wakanda City with his lady friend, Nakia. It's hot, it's dusty, there's probably the smell of spices in the air. Handmade baskets hang from pegs outside a shop. Plants grow up the side of buildings everywhere. The architecture is a jumble of exuberant shapes and forms, colored patterns, black and white stripes, and the streetlights are hoops of turquoise neon. Buildings rise right up a steep, lush green hill, taking advantage of every available space in this crowded, vibrant city where there's not even any room for cars. Instead, a streetcar with oval windows and copper trim makes its leisurely way along the narrow street, and the brightly dressed people stroll out of its... Are you bored yet? Would you like me to get on with the story? You are not a filmmaker. Well, at least we assume that you are a novelist. All that lush detail can and should exist in your mind in some form, but you cannot possibly get it all on the page and keep your story moving. You have to trust your reader's mind to flesh out the entire scene from a handful of details. Some readers prefer more description, some prefer less. The question is, which are you? Write for readers like yourself. But don't leave your reader in a featureless landscape either. You may have a vivid picture in your mind of everything in the scene and forget to share it with the reader. I see this all the time. I do it all the time. Alternatively, you may be aphantasic, someone who doesn't actually have visual images in your mental processing. Either way, you will need to think about what's important in the setting. What specifics can you include that will convey the obstacles or opportunities in the landscape? A mountain range that's difficult to cross, a powerful storm, or some other kind of weather. And be sure to populate your interior scenes too. Give a detail or two about, say, the character of the person who lives there. No reader is ever going to picture the scene exactly as you do anyway. Sorry, it is just a fact. So all you can do is provide a few specific details that drive the story forward and help the reader enter into the spirit of the setting so they can form their own impressions. The short answer to the question of how much world-building information should remain on the page for the reader is just enough. And that amount will vary. Sorry, that's not very helpful. We don't have an actual number for you. That amount is going to vary with your point of view, your narrative device, your style, and your intended reader, and also your own preferences. But we can sum it up with 3 pretty good guidelines. First, less is usually more. If you show us a lady whose ball gown is made of beetles, how much does it really matter that her eyes are green? Second, if the reader genuinely needs to understand an aspect of your fantasy world in order to understand the story, prefer description over explanation, and try not to interrupt action with either description or explanation. Show the reader a character using magic rather than explaining the system of magic. And third, in selecting details, prefer those that are going to pay off later. For example, if you're going to have the character's community wiped out by a flood in Act 3, you need to show the character living in a low-lying area in Act 1. Okay, this has been a lot to absorb, so remember, replay coming up. soon and documents. So let's do a quick recap. Today, you've learned about the 7 story types and their importance for fantasy writers. You've learned why fantasy settings or marketing category doesn't determine your story type. You've got some new ideas about story type and how it can help you meet reader expectations, and maybe some ideas about how you can use story types to innovate in the fantasy realm. And you've got a very distilled philosophy of world building. Are you feeling inspired to go forth and write your fantasy story? We hope that we have provided some useful tools today. And that is the Pages and Platforms Guide to the Essentials of Writing Fantasy. If you'd like to expand a little on the material Rachelle covered here today, be sure to stop by storypath.me to grab your free copy, /PWA, to get your free copy of the Guide to the 7 Essential Story Types. And now for the Q&A.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. We have 27 questions open right now. Just so everyone knows, we only have about 9 minutes left, so we probably won't get to all of the questions, but Anne and Rachelle will be popping into the fantasy Facebook group after this. So if you have any questions for them, check out the thread, see their post, and then you can drop your additional questions right in the comments. But we're going to try to get through as many as we can.
Michelle, too, if you can collate the outstanding questions, I will usually write up an answer sheet to them and include that with the documents.
Great. So far we have a lot of questions right off the bat about what are you supposed to do if your story doesn't fit neatly into just one category? If it fits into 2 different ones, how do you approach that?
That's one for you, Rachelle.
Oh, okay, it's for me. No story is going to fit exactly neatly into one category. You should have probably at least 2 story types playing off one another. The internal world of the character, the protagonist's mind, is pushing against what they need to do in the external world, and the external world, the things that are happening around them and trying to force them to act, are against generally what they think they should be doing or want to be doing in their head. Those 2 things create the character change or a need for character change, whether or not the character changes. So you want to have more than one. Some stories will have more than 2. Sometimes, we call the love story, sometimes the little black dress of story types, because you can add a love story to an action worldview story. That threesome is a very common combo. However,
threesome makes a really interesting love story too.
Make a threesome. You do want to have one primary story type on top with all the essential core moments, characters, and situations on the page for that primary story type. There shouldn't be a lot of confusion about what kind of book someone is reading. Even from the back cover blurb, we should know what kind of story we're picking up so that we're not confused and we don't get upset with the writer for, selling us something we didn't want. It should be pretty clear that the beginning, middle, and end of a story all support one primary story type.
Thank you. To follow up with that, Zoe asks, when your story has elements from multiple story types, how do you settle on the primary one? How do you narrow it down?
A couple of simple questions you can ask yourself on that. One is, what happens at the climax of the story, the global climax, the peak of the story? How does your protagonist change? And that's going to help you figure out which kind of story you're really telling. Do they go from close life to close to death? Do they go from ignorance to wisdom? Do they turn? You will find, if you analyze the peak moment of your story, it will help you determine what the main one is.
And generally, if you have life and death stakes, that is survival stakes are higher than other stories. So if you find yourself describing your story as life and death stakes, you probably have an action story. Many, many, many fantasy stories are action story types.
It's very common in fantasy, yeah. But it's not 100% universal in fantasy.
Nope.
And to piggyback off of that even further, Eileen asks, if the 2 story types are blended, could you name a couple of books that do that to give a real life example?
Mm-hmm. We gave about 12 examples there in the list. So when you go back to the replay there, you'll have those lists that tells you what those combinations are.
And another question, Charlotte asks, could the story type change either between the first and second novel, or even in the same novel, say something was achieved earlier on?
The definition of your novel is this is changing all the time, but basically the full complete story, there's a complete story in one novel. And if the series continues, there might be an overarching thing, but each volume, you want it to complete its own story. So in a series, you could have an action story, then you could have a crime story in the second volume. But the story arc of each volume should be one primary story type with its own arc, generally speaking. Lots of exceptions, but that's the easiest and most productive way to think about it.
And in one book, you have one full arc, not one full arc, cut halfway, another full arc, unless you're putting two books, right, into one cover, which sometimes we see in fantasy. But a book is one arc.
Ideally, yeah.
Okay, Chelsea asks, how does one match story type with subgenre? For example, my story falls under worldview. It's a coming of age story in a contemporary fantasy setting. Is coming of age a subgenre, a category, or a plot?
None of the above. Coming of age is a worldview story. It could be, yes, considered a subgenre because it's a type of worldview story, but your secondary story type is going to support that and tell us a lot about what that kind of story is. So yes, you can have think of it as a coming of age story, think of it as maturation. They go from ignorance to wisdom, or naivete to sophistication. That's their full change arc for that story.
Okay, Donna asks, do portal stories require a sci-fi type setting in at least one of their worlds in order to be classified under the fantasy genre, or can portal stories have both eras and actual historic settings, for example, 21st century and medieval?
In my understanding of a portal story, it's the fact of crossing through the portal. Narnia is kind of a portal story in a way. That is what interests the reader. And yes, sure, you can have whatever you want on either side of the portal. Absolutely. Yes. I mean,
you know what's
sure.
What's great about those is you're the god of the story and you get to decide. This is why we a lot of times write in the fantasy marketing genres and milieu, is because we're the gods. We get to decide. We get to make all this up, and we get to make the environment fit the story that we want to tell. So it's whatever you want it to be.
Also read portal stories and find out what people are doing with portal stories right now. This is the kind of thing that changes over time. So, definitely keep up with sort of what's going on in the field.
To piggyback off of that answer, we have an anonymous attendee who asked, should a fantasy author read other fantasy novels in the midst of creating their own stories?
That depends on your own state of mind. I think it's a good idea to be familiar with the current world of fantasy stories. But once you get started with your own story, I personally find that it squashes my inspiration and creativity. If I feel like, oh God, somebody did it better than me, or it's already been done. Everything's already been done. So maybe if that doesn't bother you, then yeah, keep reading. But I think for some people, if that's your sort of issue, like it's going to squash you if you go read this really, really good book that just came out, then probably save it till you're ready for editing.
When I'm writing fiction, I switch to reading nonfiction. That way, because I'll do the same thing Anne's talking about there.
Yeah.
Albert asks, which story type is the hero's journey?
None. It's primarily what you would look at that and you would see as the action story. The action story type follows very closely the traditional hero's journey. And not all story types have the hero's journey.
Right.
But they can.
I think we have time for one more question. Vika asks, what are some of the best ways to integrate images into books? Is it popular to do a small image at the beginning of each chapter?
That is outside
the realm publishing,
of
printing question.
Right.
Yeah. I've seen it done. So much. If you're self-publishing, you can do whatever you want.
Yep.
If you're not, you don't have much say in that. So I'm
Right.
not, that's just not really a question we can really answer here.
Yeah, sorry.
All right. Well, thank you to everybody
Thank
who
you.
dropped their questions in the Q&A. I'm going to
Great
drop
questions.
the links here in the
Thank
chat
you.
again for you. Please join us in the fantasy group if you have more questions for Anne and Rachelle. They will be in there later, and we will have the replay and the slides posted to the Fantasy Writers Week Hub. But thank you to everyone who attended it, and thank you so much, Anne and Rachelle. It was an amazing session.
Thank
you.
you.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.